If the flood wiped out everything, why do giants show up again? Genesis 6 gives us one of the most mysterious passages in the entire Bible. It speaks of the sons of God taking the daughters of men, and it introduces a strange word, Nephilim. They were the mighty men of old, men of renown. Then the story moves quickly. Violence fills the earth. Humanity becomes corrupt, and God sends a flood that destroys every living thing outside the ark. The judgment is total. Or is it? Because centuries later, when Israel stands on the edge of the promised land, the spies return from Canaan with a terrifying report. In Numbers 13:33, they say, "We saw the Nephilim there, and we seemed like grasshoppers in our own sight." Wait, how? If the flood destroyed all flesh except Noah and his family, how are the Nephilim still around? Did some survive? Was the flood regional rather than global? Did something like Genesis 6 happen again? Or are we misunderstanding the word entirely? This isn't just a curiosity for Bible trivia night. This question touches something deeper. It challenges how we understand judgment, evil, and the reliability of the biblical narrative. If hybrid giants survived the flood, does that mean God's judgment was incomplete? If they didn't, why does Scripture use the same word again? And if the spies were exaggerating, why would the text preserve that language? For thousands of years, Jewish scholars, Christian theologians, and modern readers have wrestled with this tension. Some have built elaborate theories. Others have dismissed the question entirely. But neither extreme does justice to the text. Because the Bible is not careless with words, and it does not introduce mysteries by accident. So tonight, we're going to walk carefully through this story. We'll ask what the Nephilim were. We'll examine what the flood actually destroyed. We'll explore why giants reappear in the land of Canaan. And in the end, we'll face the real question. What most likely happened? The answer may not be as sensational as internet headlines suggest, but it might be more powerful. Because sometimes the greatest mystery isn't about monsters. It's about how we read Scripture itself. Before we can ask what happened to the Nephilim, we need to ask what they were in the first place. The word appears in Genesis 6 verse 4. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came in to the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. That single verse has sparked centuries of debate. The Hebrew word Nephilim likely comes from a root meaning to fall. Some translate it as fallen ones. Others understand it to imply something like giants, largely because of how the word was rendered in later Greek translations. But the term itself is rare. In fact, outside of Genesis 6 and Numbers 13, it does not appear again in the Old Testament. So what does Genesis actually describe? The passage presents three key elements. The sons of God, the daughters of men, the Nephilim, described as mighty men of renown. The interpretation hinges on the identity of the sons of God. There are three major views that have historically shaped Jewish and Christian interpretation. First, the fallen angel view. This interpretation understands the sons of God as angelic beings who crossed a boundary, taking human women and producing offspring that were somehow extraordinary. This reading was common in ancient Jewish literature and appears in writings from the Second Temple period. It also explains why Genesis 6 immediately precedes a divine judgment of global scale. Second, the Sethite view. This interpretation sees the sons of God as the godly line of Seth, intermarrying with the ungodly line of Cain. The result is moral corruption, not biological hybridity. In this view, the Nephilim are powerful human warriors, men of violence and reputation. Third, the royal or tyrant view. Some scholars suggest sons of God was a term used for ancient rulers or kings who claimed divine authority. These rulers took women as they pleased, and their offspring became violent elites, mighty men known for domination. Each view attempts to stay faithful to the text while accounting for its strangeness. But notice something important. Genesis does not explicitly describe the Nephilim as half angel, half human. It calls them mighty men and men of renown. The emphasis is not on anatomy. It's on power, violence, reputation. They are associated with a world that has become morally corrupted and filled with bloodshed. Whatever their exact nature, the narrative makes one thing clear. They belong to a world spiraling out of control, and that world is about to be judged. But Genesis 6 includes a small phrase that complicates everything. And also afterward. After what? After the union? After those days? Or after the flood? That tiny phrase has fueled endless speculation. Because if the Nephilim existed in those days, and also afterward, then the story might not end with the rain. So now we turn to the flood itself. If the judgment was total, shouldn't the Nephilim have disappeared forever? Genesis does not describe the flood as partial. It describes it as absolute. The language is sweeping, deliberate, and overwhelming. All flesh died that moved on the earth. Everything on the dry land in whose nostrils was the breath of life died. He blotted out every living thing that was on the face of the ground. The repetition is intentional. The text wants you to feel the scale. This is not a localized storm or a regional catastrophe. It is portrayed as a cosmic undoing, a reversal of creation itself. Waters rise the way they did in Genesis 1 before dry land appeared. The world returns to chaos, and only one family remains. Noah, his wife, his 3 sons, and their wives. 8 people. If the Nephilim were living beings of flesh and blood, they would have perished like everyone else outside the ark. There is no mention of giants boarding the vessel. No hint that some hybrid lineage slipped through unnoticed. The narrative emphasizes that only Noah and those with him survived. So if we read Genesis straightforwardly, the conclusion seems simple. The Nephilim died in the flood. End of story. Except it's not the end of the story. Because centuries later, when Moses sends 12 spies into Canaan, something shocking appears in their report. Numbers 13:33. We saw the Nephilim there, the sons of Anak, who come from the Nephilim, and we seemed to ourselves like grasshoppers. The same word, Nephilim. And now we have a tension that demands an answer. If the flood truly wiped out all flesh except Noah's family, how can the Nephilim be present again in Canaan? There are only a few possibilities. Either the flood was not total, or the Nephilim somehow survived through Noah's family, or something like Genesis 6 happened again, or the spies were using language in a way we misunderstand. Before jumping to conclusions, we need to examine how biblical narratives communicate. Ancient Hebrew storytelling often uses comprehensive language to emphasize theological truth rather than scientific precision. When it says all, it typically means all within the scope of the judgment described. But in Genesis, the scope is universal in tone and structure. The theological purpose of the flood is clear. Human corruption had reached a breaking point. Violence filled the earth. The world required cleansing, and God acted decisively. If we suggest that hybrid giants simply survived and continued unchanged, it raises a serious theological issue. Did the judgment fail? Did the corruption remain intact? The narrative gives no indication of that. Instead, it shifts focus after the flood to covenant, to God's promise to Noah and to humanity. The story moves forward, which makes the appearance of giants in Numbers feel like a disruption. But before we assume contradiction, we must remember something crucial. The report in Numbers 13 is not God speaking. It is frightened spies speaking. And fear has a way of magnifying threats. So now the question becomes sharper. When the spies say they saw Nephilim in Canaan, are they reporting literal survivors of a pre-flood race? Or are they describing what they felt like they were facing? To answer that, we need to look closely at that moment in Numbers, because everything hinges on how we understand that report. The tension reaches its peak in Numbers 13. Israel has been delivered from Egypt. They have crossed the Red Sea. They have received the law at Sinai. Now they stand at the edge of the land promised to Abraham. 12 spies are sent into Canaan. For 40 days, they explore the territory. They see fertile valleys, fortified cities, and powerful inhabitants. When they return, they bring back fruit so large it must be carried on a pole between two men. The land is rich, but the people are afraid. 10 of the spies give a discouraging report. They acknowledge the land flows with milk and honey, but they emphasize something else. The people who dwell in the land are strong. The cities are fortified and very large, and besides, we saw the descendants of Anak there. Then comes the explosive statement. And there we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, who come from the Nephilim, and we seemed to ourselves like grasshoppers, and so we seemed to them. This single verse has fueled endless speculation. But notice something important immediately. This is not a neutral narrator speaking. This is part of a fearful report. And within moments, the text tells us the people wept and rebelled against entering the land. God later describes this report as lacking trust. So we must ask carefully, is Numbers 13:33 giving us a precise biological claim, or a dramatic description shaped by fear? Let's examine the main explanations. Keycap 1. The exaggeration theory. This is one of the most widely held interpretations among biblical scholars. The spies were afraid. They were overwhelmed by fortified cities and imposing warriors. In their fear, they used extreme language to describe what they saw. Calling the inhabitants Nephilim may have been a way of saying, these people are terrifying. They are legendary. They are unstoppable. Notice the phrase, we seem to ourselves like grasshoppers. That is subjective language. It describes perception, not measurement. The spies are expressing how small they felt, not necessarily giving a census report of hybrid giants. In fact, the next chapter makes clear that their reports spread panic and discouraged faith. Caleb and Joshua strongly disagree with them, insisting the land can be taken. If the spies exaggerated, the use of Nephilim could be rhetorical, invoking the most terrifying ancient memory possible. It would be like saying, we walked into monsters. Not a zoological claim, but an emotional one. Keycap 2. The genetic survival theory. Some propose that Nephilim DNA survived through one of Noah's daughters-in-law. If one of their wives carried Nephilim lineage, then post-flood giants could descend from that line. While this theory attempts to reconcile Genesis and Numbers literally, it faces a major issue. The text gives no indication of such survival. Genesis emphasizes Noah's righteousness and the preservation of his family, but it does not hint that corruption remained embedded genetically. Furthermore, the theological purpose of the flood suggests a decisive reset of the violence that had filled the earth. There is simply no textual evidence that hybrid giants survived via hidden lineage. It remains speculative. Keycap 3. A second angelic rebellion. Another theory suggests something similar to Genesis 6 happened again after the flood. However, the Bible never describes a second event of that nature. Genesis presents the pre-flood corruption as unique and climactic. Later scripture refers back to it as a past event of judgment, not an ongoing pattern. Without clear textual support, this view depends heavily on later interpretations rather than the biblical narrative itself. Keycap 4. Nephilim as a term for powerful warriors. This explanation bridges the tension most naturally. Over time, the word Nephilim may have become associated with legendary strength or terrifying stature. The spies, seeing unusually tall and formidable warriors, specifically the sons of Anak, used the most loaded term they knew, not because they had genealogical proof, but because it captured their fear. In other words, Nephilim may have shifted from a specific pre-flood group to a symbolic label for intimidating giants. This interpretation fits the narrative flow. It preserves the totality of the flood. It explains the emotional tone of the spies' report, and it avoids introducing speculative biology into the covenant story. But it also leaves something fascinating intact. The memory of the Nephilim endured. Their name carried weight. Even centuries after the flood, invoking them triggered fear. And fear, as we know, can reshape perception. So when Israel stood before Canaan, the greatest obstacle was not necessarily giant warriors. It was unbelief. The real battle in Numbers 13 is not against towering bodies. It is against shrinking faith. But the story of giants does not end there. Because the Bible continues to mention unusually large warriors, the Anakim, the Rephaim, and even a man named Goliath. So who were they? And how do they fit into this puzzle? That's where we turn next. If the spies exaggerated, that still leaves us with a fact. The Bible does describe unusually large people after the flood. The sons of Anak, the Rephaim, Og king of Bashan, Goliath of Gath. So who were they? Let's begin with the Anakim. In Numbers and Deuteronomy, the Anakim are described as a formidable people living in Canaan. They are associated with great height and military strength. Deuteronomy 9 verse 2 calls them a people great and tall, whose reputation caused fear throughout the region. But nowhere does the text explicitly call them angel-human hybrids. Instead, they are described as a clan, a people group with lineage, cities, and territory. The spies in Numbers 13 connect the sons of Anak to the Nephilim, but that connection appears only in their report. The narrator does not independently confirm that genealogical link. Then there are the Rephaim. This term appears multiple times in the Old Testament. Sometimes it refers to a group of ancient warriors. Other times, it seems to refer to departed spirits in poetic contexts. The word carries layers of meaning, but in historical narratives, it often describes a people known for unusual size and strength. One of the most striking examples is Og, king of Bashan. Deuteronomy 3 verse 11 notes that Og's bed was about 9 cubits long, roughly 13 feet by modern measurement. Whether that measurement is literal or symbolic, the point is clear. He was remembered as a massive and intimidating figure. Yet Og is never described as a Nephilim. He is called one of the last of the Rephaim. That distinction matters. The biblical authors seem comfortable describing large warriors without labeling them as remnants of a pre-flood hybrid race. Then we come to Goliath. The Philistine champion in 1 Samuel 17 is described as over 9 feet tall according to some manuscript traditions. His armor, spear, and sheer presence are emphasized to magnify the improbability of David's victory. But again, the narrative does not connect him to Genesis 6. He is a giant. He is terrifying, but he is fully human within the story. This pattern suggests something important. The Bible acknowledges that certain ancient peoples were unusually tall and physically imposing. Height itself is not presented as supernatural. In the ancient world, tall warriors would naturally acquire legendary reputations. Oral tradition tends to amplify physical features over generations. A man of exceptional size becomes a giant in memory. And over time, the word Nephilim could easily become shorthand for legendary giants of the past. That doesn't diminish the mystery of Genesis 6. It simply separates two categories. Pre-flood corruption described in mythic, cosmic terms. Post-flood warrior clans described in historical narrative. The text never explicitly merges them after the flood. And that silence is telling. Because if hybrid giants had truly survived divine judgment, we might expect later scripture to emphasize that as a theological problem. Instead, the focus shifts elsewhere. To covenant. To conquest. To faith. The giants become obstacles in Israel's story, not cosmic anomalies threatening the integrity of the flood. And every time they appear, they are defeated. The Anakim are driven out by Joshua and Caleb. Og is defeated by Moses' forces. Goliath falls to a shepherd boy with a sling. In each case, the narrative message is the same. No matter how large the enemy appears, they do not stand against God's purposes. So perhaps the giants in Canaan were not echoes of pre-flood hybridity. Perhaps they were reminders of something else. That fear magnifies threats, and faith shrinks them. But what did ancient Jewish interpreters believe about all of this? Did they see continuity between the Nephilim and later giants? Or did they interpret these passages differently? To answer that, we need to step into the world between the testaments. By the time of Jesus, Jewish interpretation of Genesis 6 had already developed far beyond the brief biblical account. Second Temple Judaism, the period between the Old and New Testaments, was marked by intense reflection on evil, judgment, angels, and the unseen realm. And in that world, the story of the Nephilim was not ignored. It was expanded. Some Jewish writings from this period, especially apocalyptic literature, embraced the fallen angel interpretation of Genesis 6. In these texts, the sons of God were angelic beings who corrupted humanity, and their offspring, the giants, filled the earth with violence. When the flood came, these giants were destroyed physically. But here's where it gets interesting. Certain traditions suggested that while their bodies perished, their spirits did not. According to this view, the disembodied spirits of the giants became wandering evil spirits, what later Jewish thought might associate with demons. This idea does not appear directly in the Hebrew Bible, but it shows how ancient interpreters were trying to explain the presence of ongoing evil in the world. If the flood wiped out corruption, why does wickedness continue? Their answer was spiritual continuity, not biological survival. Other Jewish traditions, however, were more restrained. Rabbinic writings later moved away from heavy angelic speculation. They tended to interpret Genesis 6 more cautiously, often favoring human-centered explanations rather than supernatural hybrid theories. What does that tell us? There was not a single unified Jewish interpretation. There were debates, diverse perspectives, creative theological reflection. And that diversity matters, because it reminds us that ancient readers wrestled with the same questions we do. How literal is Genesis 6? Are the Nephilim meant to be understood biologically, symbolically, or theologically? What is the main point of the passage? Interestingly, by the time of the New Testament, the focus of Jewish thought had shifted toward moral accountability, resurrection, covenant faithfulness, and messianic hope. The Nephilim were not central to Jewish theology. They were part of the story's background, not its climax. That perspective is important, because sometimes modern readers elevate the mysterious elements of Scripture beyond the emphasis the Bible itself gives them. Ancient Jewish interpreters explored the mystery, but they did not build their faith on giants. They built it on covenant, on Torah, on God's promises. So when we ask what happened to the Nephilim after the flood, we're stepping into a long tradition of thoughtful wrestling. Some believe their spirits lingered. Some believe they were fully destroyed. Some saw later giants as echoes of ancient terror. But the biblical text itself remains measured. It does not provide elaborate explanations. Which brings us to the deeper issue. What is at stake theologically in this question? If giants survived, what does that imply about judgment? If they didn't, why preserve the mystery at all? To answer that, we need to move from history into theology. At first glance, the question feels biological. Did giants survive the flood? But beneath that surface is something much deeper. It's a question about judgment, about justice, about whether God's actions in Genesis truly accomplished what the narrative claims. The flood is not presented as a minor correction. It is portrayed as a decisive act of divine intervention against a world consumed by violence. Genesis 6 emphasizes that corruption had spread through all flesh. The earth was filled with bloodshed. The boundary between good and evil had collapsed. The flood was a reset of moral order. If hybrid giants, symbols of extreme corruption, simply survived unchanged, it would undermine the theological force of that judgment. It would suggest that evil endured structurally intact. But that is not how the biblical story unfolds. After the flood, humanity remains sinful, yes. The heart of man is still inclined toward evil. But the narrative shifts dramatically. Instead of cosmic rebellion and angelic intrusion, the story becomes covenantal. God establishes a promise with Noah. He sets a rainbow in the sky. He binds himself to creation. The focus moves from destruction to relationship. This shift matters because it reveals that the Bible's primary concern is not genetic purity. It is moral accountability. The flood addresses violence and corruption, not height or physical abnormality. Even if large warrior clans later existed, the text never frames them as cosmic threats equal to pre-flood chaos. Instead, they become obstacles in Israel's story, obstacles overcome through faith. Consider how the giant narratives function. When Israel encounters the Anakim, the real crisis is not their size. It is Israel's fear. When David faces Goliath, the drama is not about biology. It is about trust in God. Giants serve as amplifiers of faith or unbelief. They are narrative tools highlighting the contrast between human limitation and divine power. That perspective reshapes the entire question. The issue is not whether giants were 8 feet tall or 12. The issue is whether God's purposes are thwarted by them. And consistently, the answer is no. If we obsess over whether Nephilim DNA survived, we risk missing the theological center of gravity. Scripture emphasizes that evil does not ultimately outlast divine judgment. Even when it reappears in different forms, it does not carry the same cosmic authority it once seemed to hold. The pre-flood world collapsed under violence. The post-flood world moves forward under promise. That arc matters more than the mystery. So perhaps the more pressing theological question isn't, did giants survive? But rather, what does their story teach us about fear, faith, and the character of God? And with that perspective in mind, we can finally return to the central question. What most likely happened? So what really happened to the Nephilim after the flood? If we follow the biblical text carefully, without adding speculation and without ignoring tension, a picture begins to emerge. Genesis presents the flood as decisive and total within its narrative scope. All flesh outside the ark perished. The corruption that filled the earth was judged. The pre-flood world ended. There is no explicit indication that hybrid beings survived. Centuries later, when the spies enter Canaan and claim to see Nephilim, they are speaking from fear. Their report exaggerates the danger. The language of grasshoppers reveals perception, not measurement. The word Nephilim likely carried legendary weight by that time. It had become a symbol of overwhelming strength, perhaps even a cultural memory of ancient terror. The Anakim and other giant clans were real historical opponents. They were unusually tall, formidable, and intimidating. But the Bible never clearly identifies them as remnants of pre-flood hybrid beings. And that silence is meaningful. If giants had survived divine judgment in a literal, biological sense, we might expect Scripture to emphasize that as a theological complication. Instead, the narrative focus shifts to covenant, promise, and faith. The giants fall. Og falls. The Anakim are driven out. Goliath falls. Each time, the message is consistent. No matter how large the enemy appears, they do not overturn God's purposes. So what most likely happened? The Nephilim of Genesis 6 perished in the flood. The giants of Canaan were powerful human clans whose reputation evoked ancient fear. And the spies, overwhelmed by what they saw, reached for the most terrifying word in their vocabulary. Nephilim. The mystery remains intriguing. The tension invites study. But the heart of the story is not about monsters surviving judgment. It is about whether faith survives fear. And in every generation, that question still stands. Not, are there giants? But, will we trust God when we see them?